Your support helps us bring you programs you love. Go to wyomingpbs.org, click on Support, and become a sustaining member or an annual member. It's easy and secure. Thank you.
Basically, they were young men when they left the Scandinavian area, hoping to earn their fortune in America.
You learn to get along with other people that you had to work with, and you learn to work.
The most difficult part of the whole drive was getting that 15 miles through what we call the canyon.
Just think, the people see all them ties stacked down the river to, there wasn't any trucks or anything then. Yeah, how did they get
It was one of the better jobs, experience of a lifetime.
Hello, I'm Joe Brandel. Around the turn of the century, when Americans were still pushing west into the open spaces, a vast new network of railroads moved people and commerce across the continent. To lay the tracks and maintain them, you needed wooden ties to support the rails, millions of them. Wherever the railroads went, the builders sought pine and cypress and other big trees in the nearby forests, the southern Appalachians, the Mississippi Valley, and in the west, where the rails inched across the treeless plains, they looked to Wyoming's mountainous forests. They looked to the rivers to bring the hewn timbers down in huge springtime tie drives. Beginning in 1868, they brought ties from Sherman Mountain down the Laramie River and then further west down the Medicine Bow River. Before long, tie camps were springing up across the state. Encampment, Saratoga, to the west below Evanston, and as far north as Sheridan. But the biggest production would come from the high country of the Absaroka and Wind River Mountains. It was here between 1914 and 1946 that tie hacks produced over 10 million ties. The railroads were binding a young nation together, and the work was being done by newcomers. And the job fell to the Wyoming Tie and Timber Company.
Martin Olson, who was the superintendent of the company, he came from Norway, where he had his start in a lumber or a timber operation. He obviously had to have been one of the smartest men in the world, as far as I can tell, to have thought up and figured out how to get those ties out of the woods.
Olson and his men faced two important tasks: transforming the green timber into railroad ties, and then getting those ties out of the wilderness and downstream to the railroad. For the first part of that job, the company built its headquarters high in the Wind River Mountains. Then they brought in skilled woodsmen from the old country, men who could live in rugged conditions, work through the harsh winter, and hand-hew ties with the broadaxe. Modern machinery has replaced the men who cut the trees in those days. But 100 years ago, swinging the broadaxe was both a skill and an art. Often, they worked from daylight to dark. They were paid by the piece. The more ties you made, the more wages you earned. It was just that simple. How hard was the work? Let's watch Ken Miller.
And this looks like it would be a good tree. We can get several ties out of this one. Next thing we have to do is score the log on both sides. I'll be hitting the top with the first swing, underneath with the second swing, so when I come with the broadaxe, I can use that exactly perpendicular to make as smooth a surface as possible. So on the top, on the bottom, move forward 4 to 6 inches, top, bottom. And as you move toward the base of the tree, you have to go deeper. So when you're done, the tie is still a little over 7 inches thick. Now if you did it all the time in one shape, you could just go down one side, come back the other without having to stop and breathe. Okay, on a Broadaxe, one side is completely flat. There's no angles, no arcs, no anything, just completely flat. And that's the side that goes to the tree to make the shape of it as smooth as possible. Now the other side, you can see it's wedged out, and as it goes in behind all these little chips that are hanging on there where it was scored, then it just pops those off. Sometimes it takes off just a little bit at a time, sometimes it goes, quite a ways. Now this is where you have to be careful where your toe sticks out. Like if your toe stuck out here and you have 5, 6, 7 pounds come against it with some force, off goes into your shoe and your toes. And that's where 3-toe Ole came in. Okay, the next step after both sides are pretty much smoothed out is to peel the bark off the top and the bottom. So we'll start with the top, and this is a tool called the spud, which is just a extra large wood chisel is what it is. And with this being a green tree, the bark peels off. You get right under the bark, it peels off real easy. Okay, the next step will be to measure off the ties to 8-foot lengths and then cut them with this one-man saw. Okay, the next step is to roll the tie over so we can peel the other side. Once they're cut into 8-foot lengths, then it's not so hard to do that. Okay, the tool I'm using here is called a cant hook.
The tie axe, he usually worked all winter, shovel snow, shovel out around the trees to get them sawed down and stuff. They really had to work hard for their wages.
I would guess 150 axemen around. And not counting the teamsters, I helped Andy Kruzik, and he was a teamster, but he didn't have any hauling, so he went to chopping. And by God, that guy, he never stopped. He just, felling and limbing and scoring them trees. And I worked behind him, peeling, sawing. And I think we got 48 ties with me helping, which was a damn hell of a good day's work.
Well, myself, if I got 8 ties or 10 ties, I was doing pretty good, because I was fairly young then and learning. But most of them, they cut between 20 and 30 ties a day. anywhere from 21 cents for the smallest tie, which had a 9-inch top, to 30 or 31 cents a piece, if I remember right.
But I think some of them made $8, $10 a day, maybe, which, hell, that was pretty good money, by gosh, them days. Because when I started working, I was working for $1 a day on a ranch for a number of years. Alfred Olson, then he was a tie inspector. Well, he graded all the ties. He went around from strip to strip, and he knew whose strip that was. He counted them ties out to that fella that had that strip. Turned that into Trigo. They marked whatever ties he had for that, usually every month. And so when the guy, like, if he wanted to go to town and have some money, why, he went to Trigo and got whatever he wanted, $15, $20, or $50 or what. The Teamsters were usually company men. The Teamsters had 2 or 3 teams. There was 12, 14, 1,600-pound horses. That's the way they moved the tires down to the landing where they was going to drive them, which up there, Big Worm, was all the way up from the head of the flume, way up there towards South Fork there, them ties was lined. You can see pictures of them.
The story on the Wyoming tie hacks is an important part of our Wyoming history, and because of Wyoming Public Television's commitment to local programming, you're able to watch and enjoy this program. So I hope you'll take a moment and call in your pledge of support to Wyoming Public Television. Help us continue the tradition of great local programming. Many of the tie hacks had come from Europe and come to stay, along with their families who joined them in the high country.
It was at a time of emigration into the United States.
Many of them had come to this country leaving their wife or a child overseas, and they were all trying to save enough money to send for their family. My dad had come when I was just a baby. He came to an aunt in North Dakota, and he was thinking that life would be much easier in this country because the Depression had started in Norway. But when he came here, the Depression went full force also. So it took him 10 years to save money to bring us over here. And so, as far as meeting my dad, he was a stranger.
I remember Ingeborg telling me that when she and her mother arrived, they couldn't understand their father. He had learned to speak English in the meantime, and it was sort of a mixture of English and Norwegian, and he didn't speak the home language as much as they remembered.
We came by boat to New York. We entered the Statue of Liberty, and we had name tags on our coats saying who we were and where we were going. And they put us on a train to go to Chicago, where we were met by my dad. And then we came to Riverton by train. And we drove up to the tie camp. Dad had made arrangements for me to board out during the week to go to school because they were living in a logging camp. And so I boarded with some people and went to school. I did not know a word of English, so it was quite an experience. When I'd come home, my mother would want to know, "What words did you learn in English this week?" She was very interested in learning how to speak and understand the English language.
Those years on the mountain, we were snowed in, you know. We would have had to ski off or be sledded off. Once in a while, they could keep the roads open with a bulldozer.
They usually kept a car or two at the bottom of the hill in case there was an emergency, if someone had to go to the hospital in Riverton or Lander.
But you'd have to ski to school in the winter, because we lived down by the river, and you had to go up this hill, and you'd have to ski because the snow was too deep to walk. And then you had all these books, so you couldn't use poles. You had to pack them books. You didn't have backpacks and all that in those days.
For a woman, it was plain hard work. One of the stories I tell in my book from Shirley Daniels of raising a baby out in the woods. She was in one of the outlying camps, and the baby waking up in the middle of the night, and she'd have to get up and chip the ice to get enough water to heat the formula for the baby, you know. That's pretty rough. Those were hard days, there's no doubt about that.
With so many tie hacks and their families living in such isolation, there had to be a support system.
At one time, they had used the big cookhouse in headquarters when the men lived in the bunkhouse when they were first cutting near there. But then, as the years went on, they moved the cutting. The cutting was all in farther away. It was too far away for the men to live in headquarters. So there'd be outlying camps all around, and there was always a cookhouse in each of the camps. And the men could bunk by themselves if they wanted to and cook, but most of them preferred to eat in the cookhouse.
You know, you made your own fun. You didn't have a car or anything like that. You were 100 miles from Riverton. We didn't go to doctors or anything. You just got well or died. And you know, you didn't have radio or television or any of that stuff. You didn't know what was going on in the world. So that was nice.
But we played games in the schoolyard. And in the wintertime, you skied to school. We called it going to school. Now they call it cross-country skiing. And then at recess, we went outside and skied on the hill. And at noon, we went home and had lunch and skied back. And then recess again. And then after school, take our stuff home, ski home, and then go out and ski.
You didn't have a car to drive whenever you wanted to go 2 miles or a mile. So it was nice. Well, one thing, you learned to work. You had to work for what you got. You know, and you had to saw the wood by hand and cut it and pack it in and all that sort of stuff. And everybody was poor. There wasn't anybody that had more than the other, and so you didn't have to worry about keeping up with the Joneses or anything. Yeah, it was nice, you know, to live up there, and everybody was friendly, and anybody in need, everybody pitched in and helped, you know, and it was just altogether different. And then they had the store at headquarters, you know, and they had this, they called it an ice house, and they had ice in there that kept the meat, and they had those big rings of sausages and stuff, and they had sawdust on the floor. That guy, the old butcher, or the man that was running the store, I know when we were kids, he'd take us in there and he'd slice off a piece of that good salami and stuff and give you a piece of that, and cheeses and things. That's the way they had it, and then people could come and buy in the store. And you know, the bananas came on a big rack, and it was, you know, you didn't have a lot of fruit or anything. If you got oranges or apples once in a while, that was a big treat.
And when the holidays came, they were appreciated. All the hard work, all the hard weather, all the distance between Wyoming and the old country gave way to joyous celebrations and traditions, still remembered fondly.
They did a lot of dancing in the old cookhouse. So that was the gathering place for all the parties and the dances. They'd come out of the woods, out of their camps, to come down for the big Christmas parties.
At the end of the dinner, they would push the tables and the benches back by the wall, and the Mats and brothers both played accordions. And they played for everybody to dance. And they danced till the wee hours of the morning, and it was daylight by the time we went back home. And I thought, this is different than any Christmas I have ever spent. But we had a wonderful time.
One of the things I remember the most about the school Christmas party, we almost always, the kids gave a play for the community of 20 people, whatever we had, at the cookhouse. And then the Wyoming Time and Timber Company gave every employee's kid a wonderful box. And I remember it as huge, big, huge box full of presents. And Lydia Olson and I probably assume that Louise Van Meter did it too, shopped for gifts for each of the kids, individual gifts for each of the kids ahead of time. And that was our wonderful Christmas present every year.
Spring arrived, but the job was only half done, and the next phase involved an extraordinary journey.
Well, the way it worked, why the full year-round tie hacks were working up there all winter long, and they would both hew them with their broadaxes, and then they later on put up portable sawmills where they went up into the woods and above Denor and up Warm Springs Creek and prepared all these ties and stacked them right along the edge of the tributaries to the Big Wind River, mainly Little Warm Springs and Denor. And then when it came time for the drive, well, that's when they beefed up their crew and hired maybe 40, 45, 50 men more, went in there, and then that's when the drive started.
There were no roads, no trucks, and no rails in the high country. So the ties were assembled in the high valley in the Wind River Range and pushed into a stream. They were funneled by flumes down the steepest part of the canyon and then to the Big Wind River, which took them to the treatment plant in Riverton. There were really two drives.
The first one was up on Warm Springs Canyon Creek, and that's where all the ties were brought to one location. They were flumed on smaller flumes during the high water, and that whole Warm Springs Valley was literally filled with ties. And so the first day, you had to work on the front of that great big pile of ties that went up the river, probably 3 or 4 miles, and start pulling the ties out of that big jam and into the river. And so it was usually just a hard work of pulling the ties off of that big pile into that little creek, Warm Springs Creek, and sending them down the flume. And that was day after day for about almost 3 weeks it took for that drive.
They lined them up to enter the flume so that they were spaced and not riding up on one another so they'd fly out of the flume. 50 cents an hour, 9 hours a day, 7 days a week. As good a food as could be had. And as long as you were young and stupid, it was great.
Setting up camp first, up on the upper Warm Springs River, or creek. That was cold there, in the nights especially. So we had teepees we set up, so on poles, so we could raise them with poles, and have, we usually had a couple of stakes outside to hang your boots on upside down so they would dry at night and so forth, and put our socks in. And so we camped along the river all the way down.
You furnished your own boots. The boots were drive boots, heavy, thick soles, heavy, thick uppers came about halfway up your calf of your leg. They were lace boots. Most of them had, you call them hobnails or corks or whatever. They were stuck in the bottom of the sole, and they stuck out at quarter of an inch as a gripper, like chains.
One river drive, I didn't have a teepee, so I just rolled the bedroll right on the ground. And I didn't care too much about how rough it was, because after working 9 hours on the river, we were tired, and I slept through the night without waking up, regardless of any rocks or anything else. But that was our camping and sleeping situation.
A typical day started early. Started with taking down your teepee and poles and rolling it up, taking it over to where they could load down the trucks to move to the next camp. Breakfast, and at about exactly 8 o'clock, Alfred Olson would holler, "All out," everybody got in the trucks and went to work. If the campsite was available at noon, we came in at noon for lunch. Sometimes it was remote, and lunch was brought down by boat.
I've always wanted to be on the tide drive, but I thought I was a little bit too little. I only weighed about 120 pounds, but I was determined to try. And so I drove all the way up from Riverton up to Martin Olson's cabin. And when I drove up to the cabin, he came out on the porch and said, "Who do you want?" It kind of scared me. I thought, you go gruff. Anyway, he looked me up and down and says, "Well," he says, "you're awful little, but you're young enough. Maybe you do. Go and sign up." So I was happy that I finally got on the tide drive after many years of looking forward to it. The year was 1937.
The year I was on in 1942 was early years of World War II, and there were three kinds of people on the tide drive. There was a contingent of Indians that had been on the drive before, and some first-timers. Then there was a group of Scandinavians, the tie hacks themselves, that really knew how to work the ties and handle them. And then to fill out the crew, why McLaughlin and Martin and Alfred Olson hired a bunch of us. I was a recent high school graduate, and there were a few college kids there that they probably hired on about 20 of us schoolboys, so to speak, to beef up the crew. The year I went up there, why we floated down 350,000 ties, which was a medium-sized tie drive. And I remember the first thing, we got up there just about dark, and the first thing they told me to do was to go out back of this little cabin, and they had pike poles, as they were called.
They showed us a pile of spruce saplings with the bark on, and they were around 8 to 10 feet long. And they had a pike which consisted of a point and a hook like this, hand forged, and 3 rings so you took those pikes and the rings and you made your own pike pole.
As you can see, this hook here is so you could push the ties, and then this hook here is such that you could hook them and pull them toward you.
Don't go away. We'll have more of the tie hack story in just a few minutes. But right now, I hope you'll take a moment to call in your support to Wyoming Public Television so that more local programming can be produced for Wyoming audiences. The journey that began in the Warm Springs Valley continued through a steep canyon. To do that, a flume was constructed that was as tall and twisting as a Coney Island roller coaster. It was a key link in the system that brought the ties out off the mountain.
And of course they had the big flume along the side of Warm Springs Creek there, and that was one of the engineering marvels of the state, you know.
Well, the flume was a V-shaped, made of boards waterway. Olson and Van Meter supervised the building of the flume from the head of the flume near the bridge through the Big Warm Springs Canyon natural bridge down to and into the river at the Nob Harrison place.
The flume was several years old by 1942, and the planks had shrunk as they dried out, so there was a crack in 2 or 3 places about inch or ½ inch thick. So they had some of us to try to seal those cracks. Were shoveling dirt into the flume, and they were hoping the mud would sort of seal it off. And then my job at the upper end of the flume was to hook the ties as they started to pile up into the flume with my pike pole and sort of run along the catwalk, encouraging them to go on down the creek, and then they dumped out into the pool there in Warm Springs and then went on down into the river. But it was quite a feat.
Well, I think it was unique. Where it was necessary, it was hung from the walls of the canyon. Where it could be, it was on trestles. The curves were such that the ties didn't build up momentum and fly out, and it worked. The flume went through the natural bridge, and it was kind of hairy because there wasn't room to stand upright, nor was there room for a catwalk. So when you went through the flume, you kind of monkey walked, a hand and a foot on one side and a hand and a foot on the other for a distance to where there was room enough again. About 2 miles up from the river end of it was a flume camp with 3 or 4 guys in it who monitored the ties coming down. And they kept track. If there was a space, obviously there was some problem upstream, and they notified the head end, so they stopped feeding ties in. But the biggest problem, and that wasn't really a difficult problem, once in a while a light tie would ride up on the tie ahead of it, and then when it went around a corner, the momentum would throw it out of the flume. But that was maybe 100, 200 ties a drive. It wasn't a big problem. But there was a crew monitoring the flow of ties.
Now it was time for the most dramatic part of the process. Hundreds of thousands of ties, over 600,000 in 1925, all poised to take a wild ride down the Wind River. The water churned, the ties rolled, and the men guided them down, poking, pulling, and dancing. 100, 200 men, and a big piece of the forest floating down the stream. It was a 9-mile journey by flume. It ended where Warm Springs joins the Wind River, about 9 miles upstream from Du Bois. It was July now, quite a change of season from the cold winter days when the men were out in the woods cutting trees. As the ties came into the river from the Warm Springs flume, another batch from the Absaroka Mountains floated down Dunor Creek from the east. Stacked along the banks of the river were more ties, cut at lower elevations.
And they went on down as a tributary to the Big Wind, and all merging together to come down the stream.
Second phase, after all the ties were dumped in by the flume, dumped into the Wind River about 9 miles above Du Bois, then we started the main river drive, and most of the ties of the time were hung up on the sides of on the bank or on rocks or trees, and our job was to keep standing in the water, pulling them back into the river day after day. That was the upper part of the river was easier to go, but after you got down below Du Bois in the canyon, it was very difficult to get through that canyon.
The most dramatic thing, which I'm sure you encountered in some of the movies, was when you'd get a jam and the ties would start backing up for miles, and have tens of thousands of ties all piled up and not moving.
And they had a special crew of people who were agile and knew how to handle it, who broke up the jams. Generally, The jams occurred in the Fish Canyon. There's some boulders in there. It's narrow and it's fast water. But they had a crew of 4 or 5 guys that were the jam pullers that kept that open. It just simply was a matter of keeping the ties moving downstream. You either worked in the back eddies, pulled them back into the mainstream, or if they were piled up, you pulled them in, herding ties downstream.
They worked a 9-hour day on the ice-cold Snowmelt River, wrestling with heavy ties that got heavier as they soaked up the water. Amazingly, in 30 years of tie drive, no one was killed, but boy, they did get hungry.
The food is the thing that stayed in my mind as being the best thing. That was a 3 times a day experience. And that kept us going, and I think I remember that probably more than any other thing. The cook was Adolf Solem, and he was noted to be probably the best outdoor cook in the whole West, maybe the whole world as far as I'm concerned. And in the morning, breakfast consisted of pancakes, and the pancakes were mixed up in a big wash tub. They took 15 dozen eggs were put in first, and then whatever ingredients, flour and so forth. And they're always light and fluffy, put on a big grill over the fire, open fire. And we had some of the best pancakes. And then they always had a whole Dutch oven full of bacon fried just right, another Dutch oven full of sausages, link sausage. Then there was a couple of Dutch ovens full of scrambled eggs, and anything else that went it, the syrup and everything that went with it. So we had a fabulous breakfast every day, never failed all the way down. Their breakfasts were especially good. They gave us a good start. And we needed a good start because it was from 7 o'clock until noon before we could eat again. And when we're down to Red Rocks, where the camp was visible to tourists, some people would stop in to see, well, what's all that about? And Adolf always said, well, when your fry drivers are through eating, there's always plenty of food left over, and you can eat all you want.
People from Riverton would go up the 35 miles to Diversion Dam and sort of welcome the tie hacks coming down the creek. That was another popular place to go see the ties coming down the river, because they were all jammed up behind Diversion Dam, and they also was a nice place there to set up the iron kettles and get a free meal off Wyoming tied timber.
It was never a smooth ride down the river. There were twists and turns, drops and boulders. The tie hacks made it through Fish Canyon, a natural obstacle. Then they encountered Diversion Dam. Erected in 1921 to divert water from the Wind River into the irrigation system. This, of course, reduced the amount of flow into the river, which exposed rocks, sandbars, cottonwood snags. This slowed down the tie drive.
Most of the water from Diversion Dam is being diverted down the Wyoming Canal. So at tie drive time, while the water going over the dam might be only an inch or 2 deep over the dam, and of course the ties would come down, and they wouldn't clear the dam. So they had a whole string of us stationed at the dam with pike poles, big long poles like I was telling you about here, and you just would lift the front end of the tie enough to start it over the dam, and then it would go ahead over the dam and then go on down the river. But the Diversion Dam was a full-blown obstacle, and all 350,000, or a few of them might have gone over, but they all had to be lifted an inch or 2 to clear the dam and so they could go on down river.
Getting them over the Diversion Dam was quite a problem, and the ties were backed up in that basin for miles. And I thought, how in the world do I ever get that over that dam? I found out that the basin was pretty well filled with silt. And so we were about ankle deep in silt, and the water was about up to our armpits the rest of the time. And we were able to walk along in that silt and push these ties ahead of us and gradually push them over the dam. and so feeling along with our feet and so forth. And I guess that's the thing that I remember the most, because it's probably one of the most challenging things. After we got down below Diversion Dam where the river spread out, we had to carry ties as much as 2 or 3 blocks away from the river. One day we spent all day, nearly 100 men, all day carrying one big pile of ties on our shoulders back to the river again.
You worked in crews where 2 guys loaded and about 3 other crews of 2 carried. The loaders would lift the ties up and put them on your shoulder, and you walked lockstep to the river and dumped them in and came back for another load. That was hard work, and it was difficult work.
The closest call I had was coming within a breath of drowning. A big tree had fallen down across the river, was right out into the stream, and as the tides came down, there had been a whirlpool created by this tree out into the river, and there was a whole bunch of ties, 100 or so, were stuck out there. I decided I would ride out into this whirlpool and pull these ties out into the main stream and get them on down the river. Well, I got out there, and in the milling around there, I fell off my little homemade tie boat, and I was hanging on to a tie out there and getting more and more tired, and one of the fellows on the drive, Victor Montoya, saw my plight, and I can still remember him wading out into the water, and it was deep there in that whirlpool. He was just about up to his chin, and he stuck out his pike pole, which I got a hold of, and then it pulled me over to the shore there. Otherwise, I might have been a casualty of the drive.
As it dropped down from the mountains to the high plains, the Wind River slowed and meandered. Soon the railroad bridge was in sight. The tie hacks had been weeks on the river, traveling over 100 miles. Now came some of the hardest work of all, getting the ties out of the river and stacking them at the tie plant.
Well, Billy McLaughlin was in charge of the tie yards, and he'd built an ingenious boom of logs on cables that angled into the river, and the ties would go crossways across those, and the tie jammed some 3 or 4 miles up the river. But the ties were funneled down 2 channels side by side, so the 2 different conveyor belts, 2 levels, would pick up these ties and take them up on conveyor belts.
That would take them up in one behind the other, and then as it got up to the height of the conveyor going down to where the tie yards were, why they turned, and had a guy helping them make that turn there. But the ties were stacked 14 ties high, and as they came along, wherever you were working, they had a little deal that kicked them off, so they would jump off this conveyor belt, and then your job was to stack 3 piles, 1, 2, 3, away from the conveyor belt.
The 2 of us would have to pile 360 ties in 1 hour. So that meant that the tie had to be handled every 10 seconds, and you had to be out of the way and get them straight.
One day when I was totally exhausted, pretty late in the afternoon after we'd worked all day, when I was hitting a tie just at the moment, Gene Lau put his boot out there. So I pinned him to the tie, but luck was with me. The picaroon tooth went right between his big toe and his next toe. He didn't even bleed. It was a lucky miss on my part there.
From there, they dried, and they were loaded onto dinky cars pulled by a little dinky engine, and put into a huge retort and treated with creosote to make them last longer.
The rest of the crew, well, they headed into Riverton to celebrate and spend their hard-earned money.
And of course, the end of the tie drive in Riverton was a time of great celebration for the tie hacks. So they looked forward to the end of their year cycle, a big celebration. The saloons and entertainment houses were ready for them, of course. And sometimes they would come to the end of their week of time there, all their money gone, but happy because they had a great time, and go back and start the cycle over again.
Riverton had a house of ill repute, which was a very popular stopping place for the tie hacks who'd been up there all winter long, and now were coming down the river. And some of the ladies, the women of the community, the mothers of the community, thought that was a pretty nice thing, because these wild tie hacks wouldn't be out there pursuing their daughters or their sisters or their aunts or whoever it was. And I'm sure that the Little Yellow House, as it was called, did quite a booming business after the tie hacks came to town, after months in the woods and weeks on the river.
The local office was where the Elks Club is now, and there was free beer, and that night there was a dance up above the office. Went up and down the street honking the horn of the trucks that they hauled us in. When they were broke, they put them on the snooze wagon and took them back up to the woods, and they prepared for another trip to Riverton.
The men were part of the family, and so whatever was needed, the company took care of. It was particularly noticeable in the waning years of the Wyoming Tie and Timber Company, because by then we had a lot of old-timers, old-time tie hacks, who couldn't do much out in the woods. But there was one camp we called the Old Man's Camp, and that's where the ones who really would be retired could live for as long as they wanted to. And if they wanted to go out and chop down a tie, they could do that, chop down a tree and make a tie, but they didn't have to. They weren't expected to.
Mechanization replaced many of the woodsman's skills. The winters in 1940 were much more severe. It got harder to find men willing to live and work so much of the year in the woods. In 1947, less than 100,000 ties were cut, and they were loaded onto trucks, not floated down the river. For one generation, the Broadaxe sang and carved with precision, and then it was over.